Welcome everyone to this seminar. I'm really excited. Today the topic is 5 ideas from a global diplomacy for boards. And we are going to have this session, if we can change the slide, Liselotte. We're going to have this session with Marvin Cheung, that has been collaborating with Boards Impact Forum before, Marguerite Van Cook, Matthias Frumery, and Irina Frolova-Verned. Me, myself, I'm Fernanda Torre. I'm the Operations Director for Boards Impact Forum. And we also have together with us Liselotte Engstam, that is the chair for Boards Impact Forum. And I want to give you a bit of an overview on the agenda. So we are going to have a very short introduction from us. We will hear from Marvin and Marguerite. They will present the book and the insights that are presented in the book. And then we will have a panel discussion. Following this panel discussion, we will have a poll and then a discussion around the results from this poll. So I would like to encourage you, if we can change slides, I would like to encourage you to just put comments in the chat. Feel free to put references and just to tell us where you are calling from. This first part of the webinar is being recorded and will be made available. But of course, we are not recording the discussions in the breakout rooms. We want to enforce that the breakout rooms are under Chatham rules. So you feel free to use the insights, but not really share who said what with details. And I would like to just to give you then the possibility to continue, Liselotte. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Fernanda, and we are delighted to have this really interesting way to look at how we can progress the SDGs and the climate challenges that we have in a new way. And we are delighted that Marvin Cheung and Marguerite Van Cook has actually spent time going through diplomacy and look at that. So Marvin is a business executive and a governance scholar. He co-directs the Center for Global Agenda and Venture Strategy at Unbuilt Groups. He is also Global Diplomacy Fellow at UNITAR and UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab expert. Has worked a lot with these different topics and is also working on the boards and with the boards on this topic. Dr. Marguerite Van Cook is both an adjunct professor, she's a board chair, but she's also researching the entire topic from different perspectives together with Marvin Cheung. And we're delighted that you're here. So warm welcome, and over to you, Marvin and Margaret.
We can start. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Liselotte and Fernanda, for organizing. And thank you to fellow panelists for engaging in conversations with us. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you and talk about my latest book, 5 Ideas from Global Diplomacy. Presenting with me is Dr. Marguerite Van Cook. We co-direct the Center for Global Agenda at Unbuilt Labs together, and we work together on the book's global stakeholder consultation process. I will start the presentation and walk you through the theory. Marguerite will talk about the recommendations from the book and her experience with implementation. Next slide, please. When we talk about the different visions of sustainable development and the actions we have to take to get there, it is important that we talk about change. Most people would tell me that big changes are necessary, but I hope you will also take a moment to reflect on how much change you are personally prepared for, right? Because that will help us talk about implementation in concrete terms and not just the ideal of sustainable development. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, I'll be talking first about the overall message, and then provide a brief overview of the research methods and findings. And within the 15 minutes that Margaret and I have for the presentation today, we'll end on a discussion of selected recommendations to boards. And next slide, please. Scientists have talked about climate change for close to a century. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was created in 1988. So climate change has entered global policy discussions more than 3 decades ago. When we say sustainability, we typically refer to environmental sustainability, right? This is what we associate with climate action, mitigation, and adaptation. But we know there is more to sustainable development than climate action, mitigation, and adaptation. The 2015 Millennium Development Goals, the precursor to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, recognize issues such as extreme poverty and hunger, education, and gender equality. Of course, the SDGs are even more expansive. We have good health and well-being, affordable and clean energy, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and so forth. This is to say that in the past 30 years, global goals have only considered climate action as one of the pillars of sustainable development. And we see this happening now. In the midst of wars, sustainable development issues take a back seat, and we have difficulty advancing climate talks when large populations experience a cost of living crisis, when they have to pick between heat or eat. So while we do have to reconcile with the Earth's limited resources, the current conception of sustainable development largely overlooks distributional consequences. This is to say that we want to ensure future generations are able to meet their needs, but who does this quote-unquote future generation include? Another challenge, of course, is the goal-oriented nature of this conception of sustainable development. And the way that I would frame this is this, right? Imagine walking up to someone on the street and telling them, your goal is to make $1 billion in 10 years. They probably wouldn't disagree with you on the goal, but they would also walk away with no better idea on how to get there. To be sure, it is great to have a direction, but the problem we face is that a direction does not tell you the pathway to reach it. And such is the problem with a goal-oriented definition of sustainable development. So I advocate for a method-oriented definition by Mepham and Gill in 1977, which is to understand sustainable development as the facilitation of social progress. And I'll explain this over the course of this presentation. Next slide, please. I want to keep the method discussion in my presentation short today. So I've done 2 other 10-minute presentations before on transdisciplinary systems research, which you can search up on YouTube, or you can read them in my book. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions about this later. But for the purpose of discussion today, we can consider transdisciplinary research simply as knowledge co-creation between academic and non-academic stakeholders. This is to say that non-academic stakeholders from local communities to board members are active participants in the research process and not just the subjects of research. So my novel approach on transdisciplinary systems research can be understood as a series of filters through which evidence is funneled through for synthesis. Some of the filters include the properties of complex adaptive systems and the properties of wicked problems, and that's what makes this a systems approach, right? And a large part of my work is in using methods that engage non-academic stakeholders, such as confidential interviews, workshops, and other events to validate knowledge from academic literature. Next slide, please. And as you know from my book's subtitle, I study this idea of a system-wide transformation. And I ask, how might we facilitate social progress through a system-wide transformation? And what are the processes through which global changes are enacted? At an organizational level, when we look at these networks of many organizations across the globe, there are 3 takeaways. First, we know that ideas float up from individuals to small research organizations to NGOs and decision-making bodies. This includes boards in the private sector, as well as decision-making bodies locally, such as the Supreme Court, or internationally, such as the United Nations Environment Assembly. Second, if you want to challenge existing norms, individuals have to work together in order to access economic, structural, and institutional power that's already available to people who are already large players in the industry. Third, informal constraints, i.e. culture, plays a critical role because there is no enforcement mechanism for formal constraints, i.e. laws and policies at a global level. Next slide, please. At the individual level within an organization, there are also three takeaways. First, rules are necessarily ambiguous to allow for flexibility in implementation. Second, different groups have different goals and favor different interpretations. And third, actors have to interact in order to streamline goals and build momentum. And this is the main takeaway across both the macro and micro levels on facilitating social progress, which is that interactions are critical, whether it is for an organization to signal a new issue is emerging and campaign for the issue, or for individuals to coordinate with each other and build momentum. Next slide, please. Within global governance scholarship, we use the phrase global diplomacy to describe this, and which is the set of principles, methods, and actions to achieve the common goals of the global community with an emphasis on interactions. And this is a fairly broad definition, and which is very helpful when we put this into consultation and when we look at how different issues are emerging and how different methods are coming into practice. But there are two types of interactions that are particularly conducive towards change. Next slide, please. And this serves as a very good guide when we think about and when we evaluate whether something is contributing towards global diplomacy, and which is, first of all, focused social interactions. Let me explain this, right? If you are people watching, this is called social attention. If you're participating in role-based interactions, for example, when you buy a ticket at a ticket booth, this is unfocused social interactions. So focused social interactions look specifically at interactions where there's a mutual appreciation of each other as unique individuals. And second, and this is very relevant to boards, is sustained and iterative engagements, repeated dialogue between organizations and stakeholders that demonstrate reciprocity. Reciprocity is a very key concept here. You have to be prepared to change when you go into an engagement, or else stakeholders will quickly lose faith in the process. And this is something that I think is worth remembering. Next slide, please. And these are the 5 ideas that my book presents. Health for All, the Discovery Research Fund Approach, Culture as Infrastructure, Transdisciplinary Research, and Future Studies. Marguerite will talk a little bit more about what the specific recommended action items are and how they're relevant to boards. Marguerite, you're muted.
Okay. Can we get the next slide? Here we go. So we've selected certain of the recommendations to focus on to talk about today. The first we think is very important, health for all. So we can conduct social impact measurement for impact investments through health outcomes. We believe that this type of health measurement, it can be most easily communicated at scale, at macro scale, global scale, and also at local scale. We look at how we might use health metrics to conduct social impact measurement. It's also relevant to organizations who already conduct some kind of program evaluation, measurement programs that have measurement programs in place. We will be doing a whole presentation on this. It's a very large topic. So if you want to know more, we would encourage you to join us for that. And we'll be happy to answer more questions. The Discovery Research Fund approach, which I'd like to talk about a little bit more, is to provide small grants of 500 to 250 USD for exploratory research, collaborations, and participations in the consultation process. We actually, I have experience of implementing this with visual aids. We have an archive and we also have a film program. The archive, we offered scholars small stipends to write about participants in the archive. And the archive is oftentimes, we have live artists and people who've passed away from AIDS. And so the project is the remembrance and rediscovery of the work of those artists. Through those small grants, we not only did we bring in young people who then discovered our archive and so started to work with our product, they produced research which then expanded out. We were able to go from these small essays to larger demographics who were interested in the artists that we brought forward. It led to museum shows. One specific artist had a museum show, has had gallery shows, has had books written about him. These essays also led to us having an interaction with the Whitney Museum. We had a day of presentations at the Whitney Museum, which talked not only about the archive specifically, but about the goals of general aid's health issues and our activist work with that. Yes, and so the other outcome of this was it expanded our board. We were able to bring in new people who were interested in our work because this work went so was so widely received that we were able to find new people who wanted to work with us. So it was on the board level. It worked to bring a lot of public attention to the archive. It put the organization much more centrally on the map. We have a good reputation, but it did much more to expose us to a new audience. The next recommendation is culture as infrastructure, which is hoping that organizations will donate spaces at off-peak hours to organizations to engage local communities. And again, I've had experience with this. We worked, I won't name the big company that did this for us, but several of the organizations I've worked with have done this, and it's made a tremendous difference in being able to invite different communities to a common ground that was not so politically charged or didn't give advantage to any one group. And I thought that was extremely useful. And the other recommendation I wanted to talk about today was the board apprenticeship offer program. So we're recommending that we offer financial support for apprentices to participate and host apprentices at boards, which this is really goes to where we're looking at how willing we are to change. And this allows us to bring in a whole new group of people and a whole set of new ideas. And it's been really interesting to open up our doors to groups that we normally wouldn't be able to have at our meetings. And this little bit of financial support that we've put towards this, we have a Black Women's Action Group, which is comprised of women who have been living with AIDS and HIV, and we have been able to finance them, and from that group has emerged leadership, and they've done a tremendous amount of work to make the mission visible. So I think also specifically to some of our organizations, there's an age issue and also a cultural issue of we draw from within ourselves. So this is sort of a really great way to bring in new ideas, and I'm quite enthusiastic about this particular idea. So I'm moving very quickly on what's been very interesting. So thank you so much for having us. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about some of these ideas, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about how this has played out with my boards and how I see it going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much, Marvin. We think this is fantastic to get us to think in new waves and in new ways. So now we wanted to bring on the rest of our panel, which we're delighted to have Matthias Frumery, who has a very unique position. He's Sweden's climate ambassador, and he's actually Sweden's chief negotiator for the climate negotiations within UN. And he's been working in that role for a number of years, and that is also part of what he is doing. So warm welcome, Matthias. Irina is, in this case, then also very much represented the business side and the non-executive director side. So she's an independent chair. She sits both on investment funds, but she also sits on particularly different types of energy companies and companies that is progressing with solutions to help us all get into a number of new solutions that we can use both as individuals and as members. So warm welcome, everybody. Delighted to have you. I wanted to start with actually going back a bit to the challenge and first have a bit of perspective. And maybe, Irina, I'll start with you. What is the challenge that you see that businesses and in particular boards have to help progress the SDGs as part of their way of doing business?
Yes, very good question, Liselott. Immediately, I must say, a complex question to answer very quickly. And good afternoon, everyone. As you said, I'm not a diplomat. So if I reflect that from the perspective of a global diplomacy, but of course, the topics that Margarita just presented, I would say that what we sometimes assume that when we engaged in diplomacy, when we include everyone and negotiate with people and collaborate with them, that somehow we speak the same language and we a priori understand where the other person comes from. But what actually the phase that precedes that is the phase where we start with implicit conflict. Because it is more often than not that there is some kind of dilemma. Typical dilemma for businesses, as you would know, of course, is short-term profitability versus long-term sustainability. It is not as plausible discussion as one would imagine. And what is important is maybe there are ways to use techniques of diplomats to facilitate controversial dialogue where all parties more or less first engage in a conflict rather than try to solve it by moving to a solution or a compromise, but first acknowledge that there are various and sometimes opposing views, and also that we speak maybe if not the same language, but at least the key terms that we are using. We understand what we mean when we say that. So what do we mean when we say nature positive? What do we mean when we say net zero? Is it the same? I would say that probably it is not the same. Even actually this week, I spoke to a board colleague of mine, and we talked about that. And she said, but probably if we ask 10 people in the board what they understand under sustainability, we would not get the same answer. So to answer your question is, it is, I think Covey has this, one of his habits for effective people is first aim to understand before being understood. And I would say that would be for me the main way to square this circle.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Irina. Matthias, if I turn to you and talking more now from being passionate about the topic, trying to drive the topic, negotiate, super complex. What do you see as the main challenge, and especially related to get us as businesses to be engaging in the topic and move it forward?
Thanks, Liselott, and thanks for these very insightful presentations, and great to be part of this conversation, coming from, as you say, a bit of a different perspective than what I would think many of you have. Maybe sort of starting from a slightly different angle, I would be in some ways envious. I mean, I do realize that you all have challenges in your roles as board executives, but at the same time, I would think that you all have in common the sort of a need to come to a conclusion or a decision based on the financial viability of the companies in which you operate. And I would hope, that would sometimes be more part of the kind of conversations that we're in as well as government representatives, where that maybe sense of urgency and, and bottom line financial decision making is not quite as present sometimes in negotiations, which can drag on for quite some time. So, even though the climate crisis is an urgency, the kind of decisions we're taking at the global level maybe not always would not always reflect that kind of urgency, which I would hope would be sometimes easier to reflect maybe in boardrooms. Of course, the question you might need to pose yourselves, which I guess you do in your context as board members, is exactly as you say, sort of how does this impact us, and what can we do in our role as board members to ensure that our company is on the track for being not only financially sustainable, but also environmentally, socially, and from a climate perspective, sustainable. And I would maybe think that there could be sort of a couple of questions that you as board members would be asking yourselves based on sort of that kind of approach. So, for example, making some kind of based on the science, what kind of making an assessment in terms of what kind of risks is our business challenged with, from what kind of impact could we potentially face for our particular business, whether it's changing climate in terms of storms, rainfall, floodings, heat waves. How does that impact our business, and how can we sort of throughout our value chain identify those risks so we are prepared for when the changes will happen, because they will happen. That is one thing which we are certain of. We're not, we might not be able to say at this particular stage that it will happen, in 2030, 2035, but it will happen. So the more prepared you are, the better, of course. But I think also the flip side of that, you can turn that around as well and saying, in addition to identifying the risks, what are also the opportunities in this? How can we as a business contribute with whatever kind of offer we have, whether you're in heavy industry or in the services sector? What is it that you as a business can offer in terms of solutions to alleviating the risks that you see within your business operation, but also, of course, in terms of your more general offer, depending on, again, what line of business you're in, and how can those opportunities be amplified through various types of business development, innovation throughout your value chain, to ensure that you're not only being profitable as a company, but also, of course, providing solutions to the crisis at hand, being the climate crisis in this case.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to bring up some things that some people might find a bit provocative, but I worked with boards and on boards for more than 10 years, and we talk a lot about scenarios. But we actually don't really do scenarios, to be honest. We talk about it as something, but we don't really engage with it. So what is your experiences, and how can we bring in a closer knowledge? And this goes to Fernanda's favorite topic of actually having a better joint view of the future than we actually have today. Because I think one side is, we have all of this negative future, but we haven't really engaged with our businesses to actually look at what is the possible transition that we can actually get, both take away some of the risks, but really look at the opportunities. I'd love to hear all of your perspectives. Marvin, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think having really looked at the abyss of sustainable development, right, and really examined it for a while. And I think one of the things that I do, and I keep telling myself as an advisor to a lot of different organizations and boards, is to say, well, my job here is to make it work for you, right? And so that's a very important thing to remember, which is to say that there are a lot of things that are not going to work out, and there are going to be things that are out of our control, but it's important that we remember that we're here to make it work. And more concretely, I mean, like, I think we look at scenarios, but scenario planning is not an exact science. And a lot of times you're going to have companies are going to spend, a small budget on a team of people who sit there and go like, okay, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? And you dream up all of these really wacky scenarios and try to plan for them in some ways and try to grab the attention of boards. But I think for me, what I find effective, at least let's say talking concretely about climate, is more visualizations, right? So when we publish publications from the IPCC and we draw out all the lines, well, what do those lines actually look like to people, right? And how do they affect specific organizations? And that's something that I feel like boards can actually invest more in doing, which is actually like engaging specifically with these science-based scenarios that are already available. And then we can look very specifically at what those scenarios look like, because God knows when there's a next global crisis going to come. I mean, we want to be very specific about what we plan for and making sure that we get everybody on board with the things that we can plan for.
Margaret, if you think about how you're doing scenarios with your boards, and actually also I'd like to bring in your excellent suggestion around board apprenticeship. In some way, it might be advisory boards, it might be supporting boards. What is your view on actually trying to have that as a format to accelerate?
Well, I do think that Marvin was talking about having the will and examining ourselves a little bit, because as Matthias said, we don't come in with the same views necessarily, and we don't even know what the goal is when we begin that process. But it does open us up for new ideas, and so I think it's absolutely essential in a way. So I've been on a lot of different boards. The current board that I'm working with is Visual Aids. The population that lived through the AIDS epidemic is getting their 60, 70 years old. And so for us to continue the work that we do, it's vital that we bring in younger people. Their view of what happened and why it's important is not the same. And to bring in demographics that have been overlooked. So broadening our stakeholders, typically, with a not-for-profit, we're asking for a give-get. People are coming in financially equipped. Perhaps looking at value for labor, for knowledge, those types of things, which is quite difficult to negotiate, because people, my experience with that has been that people feel less than as soon as the board starts to discuss money, financial goals. And so, these kinds of sensitivities are really important. You're talking to people who have not very much money because you're trying to engage stakeholders. And then you're talking about spending, $50,000 on a trip to something to do some project that sounds absolutely incredible to them. All of your sensitivities have to be brought into line.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. Irina, if you now look at your boards, I mean, several of your boards are there to actually help with this transition, but I bet that some of them also have very short-sighted goals that they need to attain to. How do you keep that dialogue in focus?
Yeah, what actually, when I thought about your question, for me, there is a lot of parallels between sustainability and kind of scenarios related to sustainable development and actions along those lines, with the way how businesses have been engaging in innovation. And I don't know, probably most of you have heard about a book which is a few years old already. It's called Alchemy of Growth, where the authors are exploring how 3 horizons of innovation. where they're introducing concept of ambidextrous organization, that you, on one hand, you have to run now excellently so that you can compete and all kind of things, but you also have to reinvent yourself. So, and that's the Horizon 3 innovation, which is, and Horizon 2 is where you just incremental innovation, where you more or less repurpose your products for markets. So I think there is a lot of to learn actually how we approach innovation. I must say that not many people are very good in Horizon 3 innovation because it's very hard. It is kind of a little bit schizophrenic, you know, to be here and now, but then think about the future, especially so far out. But two things maybe that I want to mention. One is doing nothing is also a scenario. So you have to ask yourself, and we do at the board. So if we were, you know, this is very hard and very difficult, and it's expensive and everything, but the solution. But if we do nothing, what does it mean? And then the second, I think, the question I always ask is the business model that we are currently have or thinking to have, will it be compatible with the future? And again, I'm using that as a definition, net zero or nature positive future that we envisage. And if the answer is not, then the next discussion that you have to have, but what does it mean for the continuity of the business? So it really hits all the things. It hits the fiduciary duty of the board members to make sure that the company, the business remains relevant over years. It also hits the needs of the public shareholders, like for example for XRG, I mentioned already City of Stockholm, so public shareholder, and pension funds that usually have a very long time horizon. So that's, I would say, how the board should think about it. And then, of course, yes, scenarios. I agree completely with what Marvin said. You can think about all kind of scenarios, but then we have this framework of impact and probability. So very low probability, very high impact scenarios would probably require enormous budget to prepare for. And then you have to assess what is your risk appetite, whether you are preparing for the big whale, kind of the black swans only, or you take some kind of approach that is keeps realistic.
Right. Thank you so much. Matthias, what is your perspective on this, and what do you want businesses to understand and engage better in?
Well, maybe just to start off with an example, you know, in terms of what I hear, at least from Swedish business actors when they engage on this topic, and maybe the most sort of clear-cut examples is major Swedish banks. As I understand, when they are engaging with their corporate customers, they're saying that we won't be providing you credit unless you can prove that your business is Paris aligned. And of course, for in various sectors, that's going to be, that Paris alignment is going to be quicker or faster or slower, you know, depending on what sector it is. But there needs to be some kind of transition plan into, you know, that your new, how your business will be conducted in a way which then meets Paris targets, both in terms of emission reductions, but also in terms of strengthening resilience, again, to sort of, you know, floodings and heat waves and so forth. So my sense is that at least in many parts of the Swedish business community, this transition is already happening, because boards and companies are getting these questions, you know, from investors, from customers, from their financiers, like their banks. So these conversations, I would assume, are becoming more and more frequent. Of course, for some, the transition is further off because you're in a line of business which might not be, you know, you don't have a large degree of emissions within your business. But of course, there are others where, you know, we have I heard examples earlier today, for example, at another event where I was, where there were actors were having difficulties in getting insurance because they were in an area, their operations were situated in an area where the risk of floodings was becoming more and more apparent. So Swedish insurance companies were not prepared to sort of offer insurance for that particular business. So of course, how does that impact, again, you know, coming back to that risk assessment, which I would think that you would need to do in terms of making sure that, you know, can we stay in this particular location? Depending on, you know, what kind of, you know, what kind of business do we have? Or do we have to strengthen, you know, very much about climate adaptation, at least for me, is infrastructure. You know, making sure that you have robust infrastructure in place, everything from your particular physical building which you operate in, you know, to the electricity you're provided with, your internet coverage, and you know, whatever kind of physical infrastructure that you have, and ensuring that you have, you know, that your business is able to operate over time, and you know, maybe it's a 24/7 business. You have to ensure that you have that kind of connectivity all through the day. So all these kind of sort of risk assessments, I would think that you, within your board operations, would need to conduct to make sure that you have that both financial and environmental sustainability in your business.
And I think we're going to come back to that later, but right now I think the boards are flooded with regulation, so they have kind of given that over to somebody else and kind of lost themselves a bit on actually how to integrate this strategically. Now we're going to ask everybody who is joined to actually to answer our little poll. So which areas should your board prioritize to make the most impact on advancing the SDGs right now, which is based on the discussion, can you collaborate with academia to innovate? Can you collaborate with policymakers to align your interest? Should you ensure that you have an advisory board to support your AI and sustainability agenda, or should you try to advance the reskilling of talent for both AI and sustainability? And this is really ugly. You can just vote on one. So if you voted, that was your vote. So we're asking everybody to take a stab at this. What would you think? What would, at this time, help your board and company to actually progress? Let's see where we are. And we're waiting. I'll wait another 5 seconds. And then I'm ending the poll. And I'm sharing the results. Okay. Should you all make a short reflection on this? Do you want to start, Marvin?
I think advisory board is probably I would say, easiest to implement because it actually is up to you, the degree of interaction that you have and the extent to which you take their advice. And so from my perspective, I think that's the easiest to implement. I would say that collaborating with academia to innovate for the future is great if you are in STEM. It makes it more difficult because of conflict of interest issues if you are in sort of social science, humanities space. And stakeholder engagement especially, I would say that engaging intermediaries, so for example, working with not-for-profits, these are all great ways where you can collaborate with researchers while not breaking the conflict of interest issue. I would say that collaborating with policymakers has historically been a large area. I think the challenge is that oftentimes policymakers look to businesses for solutions, and then businesses look back to policymakers for solutions. And so that to me is a bit of a catch-22. I think advancing reskilling is obviously a very important issue. I would say that it's also a bigger investment in terms of, it depends where you are. If you're in the US, education is expensive. But obviously, I think having great, people who understand these issues on your team and on your side are going to be a very good help towards navigating some of these challenges.
Right. Thank you for that. Do you want to comment, Matthias?
Well, looking at the results, it's interesting to see that it's the sort of the advancement of reskilling of our talent, which tops the results here, which maybe is natural because of course you want to build your own expertise in-house to make sure that you can grapple with whatever kind of challenges you need to work with. So maybe that is sort of the first step to take, but maybe also the one which would take most time, because of course building that kind of expertise, I would assume it takes time. So I would agree with Marvin, ensuring that that you have this advisory board. It's an easy fix in a way, but it might not solve your problem in the long term. And in the long-term solution lies more in building those kind of skills. So it's an interesting result.
Thank you. Irina, what's your comment?
Yeah, I actually somehow managed to override your constraint, and I voted for more than one answer.
There you go. Very good.
Yeah. So, but essentially, I think there is a merit and there is a importance to prioritize each of these points because they are all very important. Maybe it is just different for individual organization. There's no one answer that applies to everyone. Sometimes for a certain organization, it's important to pave the way and create a common platform understanding with the policymakers, because for example, I'm using XRG as example. XRG has received a grant from European Innovation Fund to help to create or advance rather or pioneer in the industry of biogenic capture and storage, carbon capture and storage. So very important work has been done in years prior to that, because it is of course a competitive process. So you have to make sure that you can convince the policy and the grant providers that you make the right thing. But also in terms of the advisory board, I noticed that, and that's I'm talking now about other board that I'm on, that certain geopolitical developments, especially the recent ones, require rethinking the, kind of your fundamental, almost fundamental vision as a company, because the company I'm thinking about is the vision is to feed the world, right? So in the past, they were able to deliver food or seeds to very far corners of the world, even where now, because of the war and because of other situation, it is impossible to do so because sanctions, etc. So they need to then to rethink this fundamental belief because they cannot do this. So advisory board in that sense is able to advise on very delicate and important compliance matters, but also better understand the geopolitical landscape.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. Margaret.
I want to reiterate the idea of transdisciplinary engagement, which is to say, if we collaborate with academia, it should just be STEM. We need to create a transdisciplinary conversation between people in the arts who are going to share that information and amplify that information. And that's been my experience, that as soon as we start working with people, if we have people that can then spread that information and make it visible, accessible, going across into different areas, then it's successful. Again, collaborating with policymakers, having spent quite a long time in New York, a lot of the policymakers are also engaged in cultural organizations. And so again, sort of looking at this in a slightly different way about pulling people in from other different organizations who may be in policy, and being a little bit more flexible in the way we think about this. So really, when we're looking at our impact, everything, to try and be a little bit more transdisciplinary, and to open that up. Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing that. Now it's everybody's turn. We will open up breakout rooms. And here's the little task that we will task you with. So you will actually act a little as a board. You will appoint the chair to lead it, the vice chair to report back. Introduce yourself. Remember that it's Chatham rules. The questions we want you to discuss is, what is it that you think that we should do more or better to actually advance the SDGs and the integration? So you will get 15 minutes to discuss that, and we will automatically put you in the rooms, and then we will take you back. A new way to discuss. I will leave it over to Fernanda.
Thank you, Liselotte. Thank you so much, everyone. Great presentation. So we have there an image of the book. Go and check it out. Really interesting. Thank you so much, Marvin, again for the collaboration. You had done our training also, and it's very good to have you presenting. About the training, we also have a new cohort for our board's oversight of sustainability starting soon. So the applications are until the 5th of November. So if you're interested. And then for our training program on board's oversight of responsible AI, we'll share new dates soon, but let us know if you're interested and we'll keep you in the loop. Upcoming events, please put on your agendas. We have now on the 4th of October, really exciting, focusing on reporting. On the 5th of November, we are going to look into the work and also a book from Pia Heidenmark, looking at her experience at IKEA. And then on the 28th of November, we have usually very exciting event that we do every year, which is the board pulse, together with INSEAD, BCG, and HNS. So please save the dates. You can already start registering to some of these events, and also for our training programs. And if you can change slides. Thank you so much again, Marvin, for the presentation. Thank you so much, Marguerite, for sharing your experience in implementing these ideas. Thank you so much, Matthias, for bringing the UN perspective. And thank you so much, Irina, for the private sector and implementing it in a business. Thank you so much to all the participants for the amazing discussions, and thank you to our partners that have been joining us in this journey. Please keep following us, and hopefully we can translate this discussion into some real action.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.